Okay, welcome back. It is Monday, May the 4th, and we are talking about President number 31, um, Herbert Hoover. Um, okay, so we are to 1929 and to 1933, which shows us that he is only one term. He is a Republican. This was the same party of Coolidge. And his Coolidge, remember, decided not to run, but did support Hoover. His vice president was Charles Custis, and he has several nicknames. A couple are the Great Humanitarian. A humanitarian is someone who helps humanity, who does something good for people. And he did lots of good things in his lifetime. And another one is the great engineer, because that was his profession. He was an engineer, and he wasn't really in politics. He wasn't a politician at all. He got into public light because of the things that he was doing to help people. And he was really helping on such a large scale, such a massive scale, that he was thrust into the public view and seen as someone who could that America wanted to be their president. So the pictures that I have up here are interesting because it shows a time difference, and I thought this was fascinating. This is what he looked like more when he was president. So this, I believe, is his presidential portrait. So this is about the age he was when he was in the White House. This is older. So it shows a difference in his age. So I thought that was cool. This is someone, now Nate was Herbert Hoover for our wax museum. So hopefully Nate knows quite a lot about this too. And we have talked a little bit about him before because he was active in World War One. So we talked about him earlier when we talked about that. And during Wilson's administration with the food administration, he was hired for that. He was Coolidge's Secretary of Commerce. So he worked with, no, hold on. He was Harding's Secretary of Commerce, and he was Coolidge. Hold on. I'll have to look that up. I'll correct myself in a minute. He worked under Harding and Coolidge. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different today because as I was researching about him, I already knew that I liked him. I have a biography on him that I've started but not finished. Story of my life. But as I was researching more about his wife, Lou Hoover, I was overwhelmed with some of the things that I was finding out. She was fascinating in her own right. That her life before the White House, after, and my notes just kept getting longer and longer and longer and longer. And so we're going to have, today is really just going to be me telling you about Lou Hoover. And then tomorrow I'm going to tell you more about the personal history of Herbert Hoover. But really, when you talk about a couple, you're going to do a lot of overlapping. Because a lot of what she was known for was what he was known for as well. So we're kind of going to be talking about them together. And then tomorrow I'll rehash a little bit about what you learned about Herbert Hoover and maybe give you a little bit more information just specifically about him, about growing up and that kind of thing. And then we'll move on to events, which is basically the beginning of the Depression. And that's what's so sad as I look at what an amazing person Hoover was and some of the list of things that he has done and people he had helped in his life, that he is known for the Depression. And he's known as being a president who couldn't stop it, who couldn't do anything to help. And My what if mind goes to what if he did stay another term. I think we might have come out of it. I'm not 100% sure, but there are a lot of people who think that. So it had to do with his view of the government and what the government should do, but not his inability to care. And I think sometimes he is presented as a president who was so removed from the people that he didn't know the suffering and that he didn't care. And I just don't think that's true. I think that he felt like his hands were tied in what he could do as far as government giving to people, that he didn't believe that was the role of the government. But we'll talk a little bit about that more later, but it goes in all so well together that I wanted to talk about that. And his beginning of his life, he has list after list after list. Like I said, he was called the great humanitarian. People thought there was nothing that he couldn't fix, that he couldn't help. And then after his presidency, he did a lot too. He helped other presidents. He helped during World War II. There were so many different things. And he has this kind of period in the middle when he was president that he is seen as bad. And then everyone forgets about the other two sides. So anyway, I'm going to have a lot to say with him because I'm a little bit of a fan. But as I was looking at Lou Hoover's life, I was amazed at just who she was too. And I'm interested in learning more about her. So let me tell you a little bit about Lou Hoover. So the First Lady, Lou Henry Hoover, was born about 1870, and she was born in Iowa, just like Herbert Hoover, but moved from Iowa when she was about 10 or so. Her dad was moving around trying to find something that would work for him. He had tried different businesses, and it just didn't work out. Eventually, they moved to California, and he did become a pretty successful banker eventually. Her dad did. But they were very outdoorsy people. She was an only child, which she was one of maybe 3 or 4 first ladies that were only children. So that's interesting. She was an only child, and her parents raised her in an unusual way for the time. They wanted her to be very active, very outdoorsy. They were out a lot. Her dad was very interested in geology, which is the study of rocks, and they would go hiking, and he would be talking to her about it. They did all kinds of different sports. She did ice skating outside. She was an expert horsewoman. She knew how to ride a horse. She could ride a horse bareback. She could ride a horse side saddle. She could ride a horse just about any way. And she liked hiking and fishing and camping, and she just was very active. She wanted to be involved outside and very actively in sports. So I thought that was interesting because of the time. Usually young ladies were not raised that way. They were raised indoors, sewing and getting ready to do the job of the household, taking care of the household. And she was raised in a completely different way. And then she got her education, and she got her teaching certificate, and she taught for a few years. But then she went on to go to a fairly new school in California at the time called Stanford, that's still still around today, and a very, very top university right now. Stanford University. And she started studying geology. So like I said, the study of the earth or the study of rocks. And she was the first woman in America to get a geology degree from Stanford. So now just from this university is what I've seen, but I wonder how many women, even in different places, had a geology degree from different universities. I don't know. But that is where she met Herbert. She called him Bert. That's where she met Herbert Hoover because he was a geology student. She was a freshman while he was a senior, and they met when she was taking a class from one of the geology professors, and he worked for the professor as an assistant. And he was very shy at first and didn't really want to talk. And they were kind of, the professor kind of pushed them together several different times. And she was friendly and just immediately kind of put him at ease and allowed, and they had similar interests. They both had lived in Iowa and then moved out to California, and they both were interested in outdoors, and so they had a lot of similar interest. So then when he graduated, he went overseas and took a job as a mining engineer in Australia. And while he was there, he became very good at what he does. He became a leader and a supervisor, and he made lots of money. So in a very short time, he made a lot of money as a mining engineer. So, but while he was in Australia, they continued their correspondence and talking to each other. And he got offered a job in China as a mining director with the government. And so he sent her a telegram saying that he got offered this job and he was going to have to move to China, and would she marry him? And she said yes, and when he came back, they got married almost immediately, and the day after they got married in a small ceremony in their home, they sailed to China. And she loved this. I think of her as having a very adventurous spirit. And so she was excited about going to new places and learning new things. And she was immediately studying about China. She studied the language. She became better at it than he did. Many people have called her a linguist, meaning that she is very good at languages. I think by the end of her life, she spoke maybe 4 or 5 languages. She knew Spanish, Chinese, Latin, don't know the other ones, maybe French. But she was very interested in language too. But she was just an interested person. She was always curious. When he was doing his job as an engineer, she was right beside him. When they were going out, she was going out. And she wasn't hired as an engineer, but she wanted to go on these adventures with them. So she was very active with them. Now remember, they're in China. This is right around 1900, and this is when the Boxer Rebellion happened. And we talked about this earlier, when a group of people rose up and got really mad about all the foreigners being in China, and the Empress got scared, remember? And the Empress allowed these people to start killing all of these foreigners. And so they lived in an American compound area, and they were constantly being shot at. And she did her job. She learned how to use a pistol, and she served her term on guard duty. She would ride her bicycle around the compound. She would go out and get food and bring it back in for those that were wounded or needed food. She was there was one story of her playing solitaire, and she heard an explosion and went up to check, and then went back to playing the game, and someone came in and said, "What's going on? Are you okay?" Came to check on her. She was like, "Yeah, that was the third explosion, so there's probably not going to be another one for a while. I'm not doing very well with this game." So it didn't really, she just was so used to, I guess, adventure, and she was so easygoing, and she just was competent in taking care of herself. While they were on these different excursions, they went to China, they were in Burma, they were all over the world in different mining jobs. And all the while, he's making money and making money. He becomes a millionaire. She has 2 children, and she brings her 2 young sons along with her everywhere they go. At one point, I think she even carried one of the babies in a basket, similar to the natives of wherever she was living at the time. She just was right in there with everybody else. Nothing was going to keep her at home. During this time, also, I don't have some of this on the screen, but I'll just tell you, he translated a very old mining book from like the 1500s, and he translated it into English, and she helped. She helped him because she knew the Latin, and she could help him with the translation, and it kept their minds active, and they just shared so many interests. They were always doing things together. Um, Now, while they were in England, World War I broke out. And I told you a little bit about his job before when we were talking about World War I. He took on a big role of helping get a lot of um, foreigners out of England. And then he started working to provide food for the Belgians. Well, she worked very um, heavily in both of these things with him. She was the head of the Administrative Women's Committee to help with conserving food for forces and for refugees. She was on a women's committee when they were trying to get all of the people out of Europe. Um, she was just always right there, supporting him in whatever he was doing. And one thing I read even said so much to the fact that you don't really notice her, but you notice him and what he was doing, and just she was always there. She was always there supporting him in whatever he was doing. Um, and and being an equal, the word that comes to mind is helpmate to whatever his interest was. Um, but what's fascinating about it, though, is I think we've seen several first ladies like that, but she had the same interest. I don't think it was that she was forcing herself to do something that she wasn't. I think she had that same interest and was willing to help and willing to do hard stuff because it was an adventure, because it was fun. She loved the idea of the Girl Scouts. Think about how she was raised. Girl Scouts was an organization that was encouraging young girls to get outside, to go camping and fishing and learn things and educate them in different ways. And she loved this idea. Not only did she like the outdoors, but she wanted to encourage women to do whatever they wanted to do. And so she didn't found the organization. The organization was founded by a lady named Juliette Lowe. But Juliette Lowe met Lou Hoover in the first few years of founding Girl Scouts and saw who she was and what she was interested in, quickly got her on board. And Lou Hoover was actually the one that encouraged Mrs. Wilson to become the first honorary president of the Girl Scouts. So I told you that the first ladies had started doing that during Wilson's term. Well, that was because of Lou Hoover, and I didn't know that at the time. She worked really hard in increasing the membership of the people that were joining Girl Scouts, and she made it kind of popular. She led troops in wherever she was living at the time. She went camping with them. She went to camp with them. She just loved it, and she remained active with the Girl Scouts for her whole life. She even started the whole cookie thing. It was her idea that in the 1930s, to raise money for the Girl Scouts, that the girls would bake. Now, they baked them. They didn't have them like they have now, but they baked cookies in their home, and they had recipes that they all used the same recipe. And then they would go door to door and sell the cookies to raise money for the Girl Scouts. So that's why you can have Thin Mints now. It's because you can thank Lou Hoover. They have a very unusual home in a town called Palo Alto in California, and it's like white stucco bricks. It looks like just a bunch, like a little kid has taken a bunch of bricks and kind of piled them on top. It was a very kind of, looks like a Native American kind of architecture, adobe type architecture. And she designed their home. This was 1920s, and she wanted to design their home. And they had a builder come in and work with her to design the home that she wanted. And so she was, I guess, an amateur architect as well. And eventually, when she died, um, Herbert Hoover donated that home to Stanford University because it's very near there, and it's the home where the president lives even today, as far as I know. It's where the president of Stanford University lives in that home, and that was designed by Lou Hoover. Okay, so she worked towards helping women be more accepted in sports. She was on several different organizations and boards where there weren't very many women representatives to support the idea of women being more involved in Olympics and in sports. I put this picture on here because this is her in her riding outfit, which I told you she loved horse riding, and she wasn't afraid to wear her riding outfit with pants that she was comfortable in. And that was not very common at the time. That was very unusual to see a woman in pants. But that's just kind of who she was. She supported women to be equal to men in a lot of different ways and to be just as active as men. She encouraged them to be active in politics also, to be active in their families and in the communities anytime there was a problem. So like the Depression or World War I, or even she was alive during World War II, encouraged women to do what they could in their homes to help out with those different efforts. She was the first lady, so now we're looking into her time, now that they're president. She was the first lady to deliver radio speeches, and she gave them a lot and for a lot of different causes. The Girl Scouts was one, Boys and Girls of America. There were lots of different things, and 4-H, and she gave a lot of radio speeches. She also had a camp built in Virginia called Camp Rapidan, built as a presidential retreat. So as a place for them to kind of get away on the weekends, to bring friends with them, to bring their staff with them, just a place to get out of Washington, D.C. for a little bit and away and then come back. While they were building it, this is a cool story. While they were building it, one of the men that was on Hoover's cabinet was out riding around and met this boy. And the boy didn't have very much. They could tell he was very poor. He didn't have, just didn't have a lot. He brought him back to meet the president. And he came back, and Hoover told him that if he brought him a raccoon, I think it was, he would pay him $5 for it. So the boy finds a raccoon, brings it back, brings it to the president, and the president pays him $5 for it. $5 at the time was an extraordinary amount of money, and they saw that this boy didn't even hardly know what to do with this much money. And they introduced him at the time. Charles Lindbergh was with them. Remember that flew the Spirit of St. Louis from New York to Paris, became like a superstar. They said, hey, here's Charles Lindbergh here, and introduced him to the boy. The boy had no idea who he was. He had no idea. They didn't have a radio. They didn't have any way of knowing what was going on in the world. And so they started meeting the families. So this was in Appalachia. So this is not in West Virginia, but very similar to how people lived here in the 1920s. And So they found this little community of people, and they found that they didn't have a schoolhouse. And these people were so far removed from everyone else that they didn't have a place to go to school or a school teacher. So the Hoovers personally started a school for these children in 1929. Lou Hoover herself picked out the teacher, who was a graduate from a college in Kentucky called Berea. They built the school. They built a little room in the school for the teacher to live there. They built some extra rooms in the school in case the kids got stuck there if there was a snow or they couldn't get back home. They provided radios. In the evening, the teacher would teach the adults because many of the adults didn't have an education. So in the evening time, the teacher was actually working with the adults in the community. And so in about a year, though, the community opened up, and a lot of those people, their land was bought and they had to move. And so they moved to areas where they were closer to school. And so the school wasn't needed. But the school was there for about a year. And they provided education for those people. And that's just an example of how they gave just out of their own personal money. That was not government. That was the Hoovers paying for something. They did that a lot. It said that when she died and her husband was going through all of her papers, he found people and organizations that she gave to that he didn't even know about. Tons. He was just saying, whoa, didn't know she gave here. Didn't she gave this money, this money, this money, these people to help them, especially during the Depression. She spoke up about women's equality, and she paid personally for the college education of several different women. And one of them was a maid from the White House, because Lou Hoover knew how important education was. And she knew it was a woman's freedom to be educated. And so she paid for this maid's education. That was neat. While one of the biggest things that happened around her during his term in office was that there was a black congressman, a senator, who was the first senator a black senator since I think 1900, and she invited all of the senators' wives to tea. Well, she invited this black congressman's wife to tea. At the time, segregation was everywhere, and there was a lot of the votes in the South did vote for Hoover, and they were trying to move some of those Southern Democrats to vote Republican. And now she did her research. She held about 4 different teas for the senators' wives, and she figured out which senators' wives would be accepting of this lady. Her last name was, I think her name was Jessie DePriest, and who would be accepting of her, and then she invited her to that tea. But she also made sure that the head of the protocol means what is acceptable in public, was at that tea. And the message she was sending was, this is okay. That black and white people can be together in a formal tea at the White House is perfectly okay. And although she didn't speak out a lot, she and Hoover both did not speak out a lot about equal rights with blacks and whites, I think they almost just assumed it should be natural. They spent so much of their life overseas and with other people, with other different nationalities, that they almost didn't see it as a big deal, and they didn't see what other people could see. And so they just treated it naturally. They treated them just like they would treat anybody else. People would write her letters during the Depression, and she actually would send money personally, her own money, okay, to these people during the Depression. She had to hire 2 or 3 extra secretaries to answer all her mail and to help her with different things. and she paid for those secretaries personally instead of having the government pay for them. A lot of the food, a lot of the entertainment that they had at the White House, they entertained very well. These people loved company. They had 3 meals alone in the White House the whole time they were there, and each meal was an anniversary. Every other meal they had lots. They would invite people all the time, and it bothered the staff because they would plan a meal for 20 people. And then an hour before the meal, they would say, "Oh, well, we invited more people. Now it's 100." And they would run in and pull everything out from the icebox and come up with these White House surprises, and feed all of these people. And the Hoovers they did a lot of it out of their own money. A lot of the people that work for them, it was very interesting because they didn't speak very much to the people that worked for them. They almost had this, maybe it was because of the time they spent overseas, they had this separation idea of those that serve and those that were being served. So they didn't speak very much to the ones that worked for them, the servants. But everything that I see that's written about them says that they were some of the easiest people to work for, that they were the kindest people, they were the best of people, just not like friendly to them, that they weren't friends with them. They didn't feel at ease with them, but they knew that they were good people. The only time, there's one quote, and I've read it 2 or 3 times, the only time Herbert Hoover raised his voice was to shout out a window to tell someone what a good job they did. So he was complimenting someone. He didn't get flustered. He didn't get upset. He didn't get angry. And they were kind. But they also just kind of kept to themselves as far as the servants. It was a very separate kind of thing. They did have 2 grandchildren that visited the White House a lot, that everybody loved and that they loved and liked to spend time with. I have here that she became very active during the war years in encouraging organizations to help, especially the Girl Scouts. So I showed you here a picture of the Girl Scouts with boxes of cookies because I wanted to remember to tell you that she helped start that the whole Girl Scout cookie thing. One thing I didn't put on here, and I should have, is that she died in 1944. So this would have been during World War II. She came home from an event, was getting changed and getting ready to go back out, and she had a heart attack very suddenly. She was active right up until the time that she died, with her husband. Her husband at that point had moved back to New York to set up an office and help more in World War II, and she was right there with them, helping encourage people to save food and to send as much as they could over to the soldiers and do what they could, and she was right there supporting him, and doing what she could to support their efforts also. I think there's probably so much more I could say. I think even in telling you this much, I have not done her a service. And one thing that I've heard about her too is that she would never. He mentioned her very little. He did write an autobiography, but he mentioned her very little in it. And some people say that's exactly how she would have liked it. She didn't want to brag about what she did. She just did it because that's what she wanted to do. She was supporting things that she had a heart for. Like I said, he didn't even know all of the money that she gave. And some of those people sent checks to pay her back later, and they found many of those checks that she never cashed. So she didn't take the money back for what she gave. I think she was a very generous woman. I think they both were very generous, and it makes me a little sad, a lot sad actually, that they are not remembered for that. That they're remembered as being in control in a very sad time, and they're also seen as not accepting the reality of how bad it is because they had money. And they did. They had a lot of money, but they spent a lot of their money during their lifetime helping other people and giving to organizations, supporting themselves at the White House, buying a lot of the food, taking care of a lot of the things going on there. She, even though, like I said, they didn't interact a lot with the servants, she gave baskets on their birthday. She gave Christmas baskets, gifts to their kids. So I like them. I just like them, and I want other people to like them too. And I want you to be interested in some of these people. And I hope you find your own favorites. You don't have to have my favorites. I hope that as we go and learn about people, that you just find people that you like. Hey, that's like me. That's interesting, and then you learn more about them. And that's kind of what I've done. Okay, so again, in your comments below, I just want you to look back through these slides. Find something that interests you. Find a question that you have and put it below. Find something that you would want to know about her and ask that question, and I may know. If I know, I'll respond. So check back to your question later and see if I've answered you. Okay? All right, give me a question or a comment, something to tell me something that interests you or something you would look up later.